Dilek, welcome to Tibetv's weekly analysis. Today we will discuss a very important book, The Fractured Himalaya, India-Tibet-China, 1949 to 1962, is the latest book on Sino-Indian relations written by Ambassador Nirupama Rao. Ambassador Nirupama Rao was the former ambassador to China and US. Ambassador Rao was the second woman Foreign Secretary of India after Chukila Iyer. So today we will try to unearth the importance of this book because it talks about Tibet. So ma'am, I thank you so much for joining Tibetv's weekly analysis virtually, and it means a lot to us.
Dilek, and thank you very much for inviting me on your show, Yeshe. Happy to be here to do this interview with Tibettv.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, I would like to begin by asking about the gist of the book before we go into details so that our viewers will get the clear idea about the book. So could you tell us the gist of the book and the idea behind this book?
Yes, Yeshe. This book, as you know, is called The Fractured Himalaya. And I gave it that title because for many of us in India, the Himalayas are that impenetrable barrier, the mountains from which we draw our strength and which have protected us for millennia. But after 1950-51, when things changed in Tibet with the entry of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, things were different. Things were no longer the same. The entire Himalayan frontier zone was transformed, and the Himalayas, I believe, were no longer that impenetrable barrier because the Chinese had arrived in Tibet and they had, the heights of Tibet from which they looked down onto the plains of India. So for that reason, I called it the Fractured Himalaya because the Himalaya was no longer that impenetrable barrier. And I recall in my book the words of Mr. Sumal Sinha, our political officer and then first Consul General in Lhasa, that he famously said, I don't know if it is an exact quote, it may be apocryphal, but he said, the Chinese have entered Tibet, the Himalayas no longer exist. So I've actually quoted that in my book. My book is the story of the relations between India and China and taking into account the changes that occurred in Tibet from 1950-1951. And as you know, Tibet, there is a distinct civilizational identity that Tibet has. And India had always been drawn to Tibet. Indians felt close to the Tibetan people, to Tibetan religion. Many of our places of pilgrimage were in Tibet. So I have tried to recount also the story of Tibet at that time and its impact on the India-China relationship, because what happened in Tibet and the events that followed the Chinese entry into Tibet impacted the India-China relationship. So I could not leave Tibet out of my story. So I would urge your audience to read my book. It's a big book, it's a fact, but I've tried to tell it like a story. I've spoken about the people who were involved in the decision making, not only Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister. I have, of course, recounted what happened to His Holiness the Dalai Lama during those years, what happened within Tibet, and what happened on the Sino-Indian boundary, which led to the conflict between India and China in 1962. So all this I have packed into a book. It is based on extensive research, both in India and in the United Kingdom, in China, and in the United States. So it's a very deeply researched book. So I would urge all those who read the book also to read the notes, the reference notes in the book, because through that also you will gain a lot of knowledge.
Ma'am, as you rightly said that the book revolves around Tibet, and I've come across many Tibetans who read your book and they all liked it a lot. So the question is, as we all know that Tibet became the centrality of Sino-Indian conflict, so my question is, how did Tibet become protagonists of your book? Even Kyle Gardner, who reviewed your book in The Wire, has the similar view. So can you tell us more on Tibet's role in this book?
So first of all, Yeshe, we have to recognize from at least we in India recognize that Tibet has a distinct civilizational identity, which is different from India, different from China, right? That's the first point I want to make. And you know that Indian Buddhism, especially the Nalanda tradition, influenced Tibetan Buddhism a great deal, and that connection is very important. When China entered Tibet in 1950, my book talks about it. India made very strong protests at that time because we wanted issues between China and India to be settled peacefully. We did not want military conflict or confrontation. Of course, Mr. Nehru, our first prime minister, was not very inclined to focus on Tibet's status as distinct from China's, and he wanted to adjust the relations, taking into account the changes in Tibet, and also to look at the unsettled conditions that existed in the border areas of India, because India was a new nation. It had to consolidate its presence along these very high frontiers. Now, as you know, Yeshe, in the Himalaya, cultural boundaries transcend political boundaries. We all know that. They overflow. Actually, the boundary, the story, as I said, cuts across the map. My story cuts across the map because map lines don't divide people, especially in these frontier zones. And linguistically, culturally, there are so many links between our Himalayan areas, India's Himalayan zones as with Tibet. But the problem, I think, was at that time we were a new nation. We had to understand what our strengths and weaknesses were, and there was no question of us resisting China's entry into Tibet militarily. Nobody, was able to do that at that time. Which is, of course, what happened. We have to understand that is how history played out. And we also, I mean, this concept of a buffer state between India and China, that was unrealistic because those concepts perhaps existed during the colonial times, during Britain's rule over India. But once we became independent, we discarded those concepts. We did not take those on board. And but the fact was that the rights and obligations vis-a-vis Tibet that India enjoyed at the time of independence were based on the 1914 Simla Convention. And the McMahon line, which is the boundary between Arunachal Pradesh and the Tibet Autonomous Region, was an offshoot of the Simla Convention, was an offshoot of that conference. You know that. So one of our officials, Mr. Sumul Sinha, who plays a very key role, I've mentioned him earlier also, he said very, I think, presciently and very significantly that we would expose ourselves to claims by the Chinese in the area which is now Arunachal Pradesh because we couldn't disregard the Simla Convention. If we disregarded the Simla Convention, we would expose ourselves to these claims by China. So that's where the problem arose. The rights and privileges that we gave up concerning Tibet stemmed from the Simla Convention. But the McMahon line, the border between Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet, also stems from that Simla Convention. So perhaps we should have treated this as a package at that time.
Ma'am, one of the most fascinating aspect of your book is that what Samul Sinha, who was then a political officer in Lhasa in 1950s, said about the political scenario then. So he said, I quote, "The Chinese have entered Tibet, the Himalayas have ceased to exist." So you have also spoken on this statement. So the question is, how prophetic was it then? And can you also tell us its relevance in today's time?
Yes, that's why my book title is The Fractured Himalaya, as I mentioned. The book is called The Fractured Himalaya because the geopolitical changes that occurred after 1950 introduced a profound change in the situation along our borders. So I call it the fractured Himalaya because we have had so many problems relating to the border that we share today with China in the Tibet Autonomous Region and our areas. And so in many ways, the Himalaya has been fractured for that reason. So how does it impact the current situation? Well, first of all, the issue of the shared frontier between India and China has not been resolved. Each side has their position in the matter, and we have not been able to come to any satisfactory, reasonable, negotiated conclusion as to where both sides recognize this border and we can have peace in the long run between the two countries. Today, in eastern Ladakh, the problems that we have with China. And we have heard some news reports of what is happening on the Chinese side, north of the McMahon line, north of the border between Arunachal Pradesh and China. So the border is unsettled. So the Himalaya continues to be fractured. We have not been able to mend the fissures and the breakages that happened during the period between 1949 and 1962, which is why, again, I urge your readers to understand all that happened during this key period of 13 years between 1949 and 1962, because all the clues to what is happening today you can find embedded in this story.
Ma'am, the book is actually a culmination of a very complex period that is from 1949 to 1962. So on this, C. Raja Mohan, who also reviewed your book in the Indian Express, so he said that the history of these troubled 13 years between India and China have been told by many others, but Rao makes it a lot easier to understand. So, so how does your book stand out from others?
Well, that's really for the readers and the critics to say, Yeshe. But as I mentioned in the introduction, I've tried to tell a history with human characteristics. I've tried to bring out, how the decisions were taken, who the personalities involved were, both on the Indian side, the Tibetan side, and the Chinese side. So I've tried to bring alive the human quotient of this story. There have been many books written on the subject, Yeshe, as you yourself mentioned, as Dr. Raja Mohan also mentioned. Many books have been written. This is a terrain that has been mapped, as it were, very intensively and in full detail. But my book looks at it from the angle of a practitioner. I was a diplomat for many years, so I literally was in the trenches looking at these issues and trying to understand them and dealing with the Chinese, being a part of many negotiations that were held with the Chinese, and also interacting with our Tibetan friends in India, the refugee community, and of course, above all, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. As you know, His Holiness gave me a wonderful interview at the start of my research on the book in 2014. I traveled to Dharamshala, where you are, and I spent about an hour and a half with His Holiness discussing some of the issues that I've covered in my book. So the point is that I've tried to tell this story, as I said, like a set of moving pictures. These are pictures I've tried to create. I've tried to paint a canvas and create a coat, I've said, of many colors that brings alive the story to the reader, so that it's not a dry story. It's something that tells you that these were people. People were involved in these decisions. It's very well today, when we have the hindsight, to say so-and-so acted wrongly, or Nehru was at fault for this or that, or, we should have handled the Tibet issue differently. But I wanted to give the full perspective and to create a sense of understanding, and also to deepen the rational understanding of these issues. not from the political point of view, not from the point of view of this party or that party, but I tried to, do it and write it in a way that people will say, okay, now we understand the full picture. This is what happened. This is the situation India was placed in. So I felt should be my contribution to a younger generation, because I was given the privilege of handling these issues, which very few others have had, and I wanted to. This is my way of giving back. We always say when society gives you something, you should be able to give back to society in a good way, in a positive way. So I've told the story objectively, but also with a great deal of positivity. I've not tried to be judgmental. I've tried to be fair to every side. So it is for the reader then to draw his or her judgment.
Ma'am, as you said that the book is basically for the younger generation of India. So I would like to ask you a very different question. For Tibetans, from what perspectives should they read this book?
Well, Tibetans should read this book from the perspective of not only their perspective, the Tibetan perspective, but also from the Indian perspective. I really want them to, because I know you have your opinions about China and you have your attitudes and your views. I cannot change that, but I want you to understand how India played her role in this story. So I want you to understand the Indian perspective. I really sincerely want you to understand the Indian perspective, and how there was a great deal of love and affection and respect for the Tibetan people and for His Holiness throughout the story. Regardless of what happened in Tibet, India had a great deal of connections with Tibet. Forget about what the British did or did not do, what those privileges were that the British gave us in Tibet. Much more than that, Tibet is a place of pilgrimage for many Indians. Even it continues to be so. It's a very sacred. Somebody calls Tibet high peaks and pure earth. I think that really sums up how we Indians regard Tibet also.
Ma'am, we have been telling our Indian brothers and sisters that there can't be a sustained solution to India-China conflict as long as Sino-Tibet conflict is not resolved. So does your book concur with these proposition, and what is your view?
I have not really addressed the issue of Sino-Tibetan conflict. That's the word you use. I would use the word Sino-Tibetan differences, because I don't think there is conflict, but there are differences, especially between the exile community, the Tibetans in exile, and the Chinese government. I know that you have held many, many rounds of negotiations from the early 1980s onwards between Tibetan people and the Tibetan personalities who hold positions of responsibility in the exiled community and the Chinese side. And I've personally always wanted these discussions to conclude with decisions that preserve the cultural identity of the Tibetans, the religious identity, that do not hurt their sentiments. Obviously in India we would not want the Tibetan people to be unhappy with their current situation. But we also, I must emphasize, the position of the government of India is that they recognize Tibet. They recognize Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. That is a fact. We have to appreciate the reality of the situation today. But within that circumference, within that structure, I hope that decisions can be taken and settlements arrived at that will help the Tibetan people, that will give them that ability to practice their religion freely, to preserve their culture, and also to have links and interactions and good relations with people in the frontier zones of India, with the Himalayan people all across this long frontier, because there is a Himalayan world there to which Tibet also belongs. And, the climate of our region, the water in our region, the well-being of billions of people is tied to Tibet, because geographically that's where you are placed. You're the source of many rivers. The climate, climate change, the melting of glaciers, all that affects us in the lower regions. So what happens in Tibet is of concern to all of us, because it affects our lives. It affects our future. It will affect the future of our children. So I hope that Tibet will be an area of peace and happiness, and your connections with our part of the Himalayas can be restored. I really hope for that, and I hope that the Chinese government will also look at it with that kind of foresight, that we need that kind of connectivity. We cannot shut off this area from the rest of the world, especially from the frontier zones of India, because people are connected, people have links, and these links have been broken, which is a tragedy.
Ma'am, before we end our discussion, I would like to ask you a very important question. In the introduction to the book, you have slightly mentioned about the Dalai Lama's reincarnation issue, and we all know that the Chinese government is interfering in this matter. So, from your perspective, what can India do to support the Tibetan people in their choice of the next Dalai Lama?
I don't really know. I'm not privy to the discussions within the Indian government on the issue. I'm retired, as you know. But I personally feel, and I hope and I pray that whatever decision, first of all, I pray for the long life of His Holiness. I really pray for his good health, and we revere him very, very deeply here in India. So we wish him the very, very best. So that is the first point I want to make. I always have felt that you cannot take Tibet out of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and you cannot take His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, out of Tibet. So that is so important for us to recognize. I know the Chinese side pronounces its views on the reincarnation issue from time to time. The Chinese have always had a view on this, even before the PRC came into existence, even during the nationalist era, even a little before that. When the 13th Dalai Lama passed, and the 14th, our present Holiness, was identified and brought from Shanghai to Lhasa. We all know how the Chinese were acting at that time. So they have a certain attitude to this, and now today that is backed up by their military power and the presence that they have in Tibet. So it's a complicated situation, but to me the core issue is the religious identity of the Tibetan people. The deep influence that their religion has on every aspect of their life. And a communist regime perhaps does not understand how deep religion, how the deep meaning that religion exercises for not only Tibetan people, but also in India, the deep influence of religion on our lives. So we have a perspective that is very informed and very influenced and colored by our religious beliefs. So I think that whatever decision that the Chinese government takes should take into account, should have empathy and compassion for the Tibetan people, and to respect their religious sentiments more than anything else.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Before I conclude, I would like to recommend this book to all Tibetans. As Ambassador Rao has already spoken about the importance of the book and how Tibet plays an important role in Sino-Indian relations. So with this, I would like to thank Ambassador Nirupama Rao for taking out time with Tibet TV's weekly analysis. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. A pleasure to have done this interview. And I wish you good luck.